Global trade looks borderless. Cargo ships cross oceans. Capital moves across continents. Markets open in Tokyo, close in New York, and reopen in London before most people even wake up. It feels seamless, but it isn't, because in moment of tension, choke points stop being simple places on a map. They become pressure valves of supply, capital, and power. Nearly one-fifth of the world's oil passes through a strip of water barely 21 miles wide. A single canal in Egypt carries more than 10% of global trade. And in 2021, one grounded container ship blocked the Suez Canal for 6 days, freezing almost $10 billion of trade every single day. The global financial system may run on satellites, algorithms, and spreadsheets, but physically, it squeezes through a handful of narrow corridors of land and sea. And when those corridors tighten, money tightens with them. Welcome to Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing's ever as simple as it first appears. This is the story of why strategic choke points have always shaped global finance. Not just wars, not just empires, but inflation, currency dominance, sovereign debt, and global crises. Because when geography narrows, leverage concentrates, and leverage under pressure becomes power. Globalization creates the illusion that everything is connected evenly, but trade doesn't move evenly across the planet. It moves through arteries, and arteries can be blocked. This pattern is ancient. In the 5th century BCE, the Hellespont, the narrow strait linking the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea, became a strategic obsession for the Persian Empire. During his invasion of Greece in 480 BCE, the Persian king Xerxes famously built pontoon bridges across the strait. Why? Because control of the Hellespont meant control of grain shipments from the Black Sea, the lifeline that fed Athens. This wasn't just military strategy. It was economic survival. Athens relied heavily on imported grain. Disrupt that flow and food prices surge. Destabilize food prices, and you destabilize the state itself. Geography created leverage. Leverage created conflict. Conflict reshaped power. Now fast forward 2,000 years. In 1869, the Suez Canal opened under a joint French and Egyptian initiative. For the first time, ships traveling between Europe and Asia could bypass the long route around the Cape of Good Hope. A journey that once took months suddenly became weeks shorter. Shipping costs fell. Trade accelerated. But canals don't just shorten distance. They concentrate power. The British Empire immediately understood what Suez meant. India, the crown jewel of the empire, lay at the end of that route. Control Suez, and you control the fastest path to imperial wealth. So in 1875, when Egypt's ruler Ismail Pasha fell into financial crisis after massive modernization debts, Britain stepped in and purchased a controlling stake in a canal company. This wasn't charity. It was strategy. Control of Suez guaranteed British access to Asian trade and reinforced London's role as the center of global finance. When global commerce flows through your shipping lanes, your currency gains influence. Your banks gain power. Your insurers gain dominance. The global supremacy of the British pound sterling was not abstract. It was maritime. By the late 19th century, London had become the world's financial clearinghouse. Trade bills were settled in sterling. Insurance contracts were written in sterling. Governments issued sovereign debt in sterling. But that dominance would not last forever. In 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, abruptly ending decades of British and French control. Britain, France, and Israel responded with a military intervention. But something unexpected happened. The United States, worried about Soviet escalation and global financial instability, forced Britain to withdraw, and suddenly the deeper truth was exposed. Britain was no longer the undisputed financial superpower. Its foreign reserves were limited. The pound came under pressure, and Washington refused to support sterling unconditionally. Within weeks, Britain had no choice but to retreat, both militarily and financially. The Suez Crisis became a symbolic turning point in Britain's imperial decline. Geography shifted, power shifted, and finance followed. As Britain lost leverage over Suez, its ability to sustain global financial dominance weakened. Meanwhile, the U.S. dollar's rise accelerated. Control the canal, influence the currency. But canals are only one type of choke point. Energy is another. The Strait of Hormuz, located between Iran and Oman, connects the Persian Gulf to the Arabian Sea. Roughly 20% of global oil consumption flows through it every single day. That's not just a statistic. It's a pressure point. In 1973, after the Yom Kippur War, OPEC imposed an oil embargo against the United States and several Western nations. Oil prices quadrupled within months. Energy-dependent economies suddenly faced a nightmare scenario. Rising inflation combined with economic stagnation. The result was something economists once believed impossible. Stagflation, high inflation, and high unemployment at the same time. This crisis wasn't triggered solely by reckless money printing. It began with a supply shock in a geographically constrained region. When oil supply tightens at a choke point, energy prices surge. And energy feeds into everything. Transportation, manufacturing, heating, food production. Inflation spreads across the entire economy. Central banks react. Interest rates rise. Debt servicing costs increase. Government budgets strain. Currencies fluctuate. This is a chain reaction. Choke point disruption. Commodity spike. Inflation surge. Monetary tightening. Debt stress. Sometimes inflation doesn't begin in a printing press. Sometimes it begins in a narrow stretch of water. And the story doesn't end there. The Strait of Malacca, between Malaysia and Indonesia, handles roughly a quarter to a third of global trade, including the majority of energy imports flowing to China, Japan, and South Korea. It is one of the busiest shipping lanes on Earth. If Malacca were ever blocked, energy-hungry Asian economies would face immediate shortages. Shipping costs would surge. Insurance premiums would spike. Financial markets would reprice global risk within hours. Because global finance reacts instantly to physical constraints. Another modern vulnerability lies in the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan produces over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductor chips, primarily through the company TSMC. These chips power smartphones, data centers, artificial intelligence systems, military hardware, and the digital infrastructure of modern finance. During 2021 and 2022, pandemic disruptions triggered a global chip shortage. Car production slowed. Electronics became harder to source. Industrial output slipped. Now imagine that disruption multiplied by geopolitical conflict. Block Taiwan semiconductor exports, and you wouldn't just disrupt technology. You would disrupt the digital backbone of the global financial system. Markets may be digital, but trade remains physical. The two are inseparable. Even climate can create choke points. In 2023 and 2024, severe drought lowered water levels in the Panama Canal, reducing the number of ships that could pass each day. Shipping delays increased. Freight costs climbed. Supply chains adjusted. A canal built in 1914, once a masterpiece of American engineering and strategic power, suddenly became vulnerable to rainfall patterns. Globalization is not frictionless. It is conditional. What connects all these examples is one simple idea: compression. When global trade compresses through narrow corridors, leverage emerges, and leverage shapes finance. Insurance premiums rise when shipping routes are threatened. Commodity prices adjust to risk. Bond yields shift as inflation expectations move. Currencies fluctuate as trade balances change. Financial markets are not detached from geography. They are hypersensitive to it. And the more integrated the world becomes, the more critical these choke points become. Because integration increases dependency. Dependency creates vulnerability. Vulnerability creates pricing power. And pricing power translates into influence over inflation, monetary policy, and capital flows. The 2021 Suez blockage caused by the container ship Ever Given offered a modern reminder. A single vessel ran aground in the canal for just 6 days. Hundreds of ships were delayed. Supply chains stalled. Oil prices ticked upward. And the world was reminded of something uncomfortable. Global trade may look limitless, but it still moves through a few narrow gates. Markets reacted. 6 days. That's all it took for a single stranded ship in the Suez Canal to rattle global trade in 2021. Now imagine something far more serious. Not an accident, but a sustained closure caused by conflict. In late February 2026, tensions in the Middle East escalated dramatically. Joint U.S. and Israeli strikes targeted senior Iranian leadership. The attack killed Iran's supreme leader and triggered immediate retaliation. Missiles were launched. Military forces mobilized across the region. Naval fleets repositioned across the Persian Gulf. The situation escalated quickly, and almost instantly, financial markets reacted, not because of ideology, not because of political headlines, but because of geography, because of a narrow maritime corridor known as the Strait of Hormuz. Nearly one-fifth of the world's daily oil supply passes through that single passage of water connecting the Persian Gulf to the global energy market. When tensions rise there, markets do not wait for confirmation. They react immediately. Tanker traffic slows. Shipping companies reassess routes. Insurance premiums surge as underwriters price the risk of missile strikes or naval confrontation. Energy traders begin bidding up oil futures, anticipating the possibility of supply disruption. This is not speculation. It is structural. When a choke point destabilizes, oil markets tighten. When oil markets tighten, inflation expectations rise. When inflation expectations rise, bond yields adjust upward. And when bond yields rise, the ripple spreads through the entire financial system. Equity valuations are recalculated. Mortgage rates adjust. Corporate borrowing costs increase. Pension funds rebalance portfolios. Sovereign wealth funds hedge exposure. In other words, a missile launch in the Persian Gulf can eventually influence the interest rate on a home loan thousands of miles away. Global finance does not respond primarily to abstract danger. It responds to bottlenecks. We have seen this chain reaction before. We saw it during the oil shocks of the 1970s. We saw it during the 1956 Suez Crisis. We saw it during the pandemic-era supply chain breakdowns. And once again, we are seeing the pattern unfold. But today's environment introduces an additional layer of fragility. The global economy is now heavily indebted. Government debt across advanced economies sits at historically elevated levels. Corporations have accumulated significant leverage through years of low interest rates. Households remain deeply tied to mortgage debt, consumer credit, and rising living costs. Meanwhile, central banks are still navigating the aftermath of pandemic-era inflation and uneven economic growth. In this environment, supply shocks carry greater consequences. When debt levels are high, inflation becomes more destabilizing. When inflation rises sharply, central banks are forced into difficult choices. Raise interest rates too quickly, and economic growth slows. Wait too long, and inflation erodes purchasing power and financial stability. Either path carries risk. Strategic choke points magnify that tension. Imagine oil shipments through Hormuz being disrupted for weeks. Energy importing nations would immediately face rising trade deficits. Their currencies could weaken as more capital flows outward to pay for higher-priced imports. Governments might intervene to subsidize fuel prices in order to prevent domestic unrest. Fiscal deficits would widen. Public debt burdens would grow. Investors, seeing greater uncertainty, would demand higher yields to compensate for the added risk. All of this can begin without a single tanker being sunk. Markets do not require catastrophe. They only require uncertainty. Financial markets price probability. Insurance companies price exposure. Central banks price expectations. And the more fragile the economic system becomes, the more sensitive it becomes to disruptions in physical geography. Now step back and widen the lens. The Strait of Hormuz is only one node in a much larger network of global choke points. The Red Sea shipping lanes have recently faced disruptions tied to regional conflicts. The Panama Canal has struggled with reduced capacity due to drought and declining water levels. The Taiwan Strait remains one of the most dangerous geopolitical flashpoints in the modern world, directly tied to global semiconductor supply. These events are not isolated incidents. They are interconnected stress points within a highly optimized global system. Modern globalization has created extraordinary efficiency. Supply chains are faster. Shipping routes are shorter. Production networks are highly coordinated. But efficiency has come with a hidden cost. Redundancy has largely disappeared. Decades ago, trade routes were longer and often more diversified. Disruptions took time to cascade across the global economy. Today, supply chains operate on just-in-time logistics. Companies maintain minimal inventory to reduce storage costs. Goods arrive precisely when needed. This system is efficient but fragile. When continuity breaks, volatility rises quickly. During the pandemic, for example, container shipping rates between Asia and Europe increased multiple times over. Ports became congested. Factories slowed production. Commodity prices surged. Consumer prices followed. Inflation in several advanced economies reached levels not seen in decades. Central banks responded with aggressive interest rate increases. Asset prices adjusted. Housing markets cooled. And global growth slowed. But the root cause of that financial turbulence was not purely monetary. It began with physical disruption. Strategic choke points rarely create inflation by themselves, but they can ignite the spark. They do not automatically collapse currencies, but they can accelerate capital flight. They do not guarantee recession, but they dramatically increase the probability of policy miscalculation. And policy miscalculations in a highly leveraged world are extremely expensive. If policymakers receive medals for assuming stability in an unstable system, many would already be standing on the podium. Markets, however, are far less sentimental. They adjust rapidly. When risk premiums rise in shipping lanes, those costs feed directly into trade finance. When trade finance becomes more expensive, corporate margins shrink. When margins shrink, earnings forecasts fall. When earnings forecasts fall, stock prices follow. Behind every geopolitical headline lies a spreadsheet quietly recalculating exposure. This is why strategic choke points matter far beyond military strategy. They influence inflation trajectories. They shape interest rate policy. They affect sovereign credit ratings. They alter currency flows. And they remind us of something fundamental. Global finance may appear digital, but it rests on physical infrastructure. For investors and for ordinary citizens seeking financial stability, this is not abstract theory. It is risk awareness. You cannot predict every crisis, but you can understand the structure of vulnerability. Start with simple questions. Where does essential global trade concentrate? How dependent is your economy on imported energy? How reliant is it on critical components produced in a single region? How sensitive is your currency to commodity price fluctuations? And how leveraged is a financial system when shocks occur? History shows that choke points rarely disappear. They simply shift. The Hellespont once determined the survival of Athens. The Suez Canal once secured Britain's imperial lifeline. The Strait of Hormuz now influences the modern energy market. The Strait of Malacca feeds Asian industrial powerhouses. And Taiwan's semiconductor industry underpins the digital infrastructure of the global economy. Control over these arteries creates leverage. Leverage shapes negotiation power. Negotiation power shapes financial outcomes. Global markets may look digital, but the system still runs through narrow corridors of land and sea. And when those corridors tighten, money follows. Strategic choke points have shaped global finance for centuries because they compress trade into controllable space. Control over space influences supply. Supply influences prices. Prices shape inflation. Inflation drives monetary policy. Monetary policy determines credit conditions. And credit conditions determine who thrives and who struggles. Geography does not care about ideology. It does not respect central bank independence. It does not negotiate with bond markets. It simply constrains them. History may not repeat itself exactly, but geography rarely changes. So the next time markets move sharply after news from a distant strait or canal, remember this. Finance is not floating above the world. It is anchored firmly to it. And if you want to protect your wealth in an interconnected age, you must understand not only balance sheets, but bottlenecks. If this gave you a new perspective, consider subscribing. History often hides the answers. You just have to know where to look.